Everybody, it's Charles, your hobby hero, coming at you with the video today to show you how to beat the Ruby Amethyst control list. Now, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button down in the bottom corner. I do appreciate it. I do put out regular content about the hobbies that I love the most, with this channel being dedicated to the card games that I play. Now, if you've been paying any attention to the competitive scene, you'll know that one of the most popular decks in the format right now is the Ruby Amethyst control list. Now, I do say most popular and not the best deck because I genuinely believe we don't have a best deck in the format right now. But this deck is very, very popular, so if you're going to a big tournament, you need to know how to play this matchup. So we're going to be taking a look at the actual list itself so we can see kind of what makes the deck work, some of its weaknesses right out of the gates, look at some cards that really help make the matchup advantageous for you, and some play styles that can help increase your win rate against it as well. And at the very end of the video, we'll look at some sample deck lists that you may consider taking to your next tournament event. Without further ado, let's jump in and take a look at the Ruby Amethyst builds.
Alright, so here we have the list, and for the list, I just chose one that had performed well at a recent tournament. This was the CCS 1K, the Kendall Burdett Top 4 list at this point. I'm not saying that this is the definitive best list, so, I mean, that can be argued by a lot of different people, but we're going to take a look at what's in this list specifically, as I think it serves a good purpose as far as what you can expect to see in most lists. There's nothing in here that's too crazy. No huge omissions that are in this list that would just surprise you in another matchup. But we'll take a look at it real quick. For Archimedes, I've seen combinations of Archimedes and Befuddle. I personally prefer the Archimedes over Befuddle. He is running a full 4 set of the Magic Brooms. This is kind of a nod to the mirror matches as well as the few mill decks that have popped up. This allows him to cycle back in his threats whenever the other control players are running out of their threats. You have 4 Gaston as an early answer to your aggro matchups. Maleficent in there for the card draw. He is running 2 of the Rafikis. I have seen this card slowly just dwindle in number of copies that are in the build. I think a lot of it is just due to the fact that it is uninkable and they just can't run as many copies as they would like to. It is a great card for the aggro matchups, which I think are probably this deck's worst matchups. I've got Aladdin in the 3-drop spot, mostly just there to shift into the big Aladdin, but the 1 lore generation can throw off some math late in the game as well. He is running a full 4 set of the Mickey Mouse Sorcerer. This card I'm less impressed with. I mean, it is early lore generation for the deck, which is not terrible, but this deck really doesn't need it, and you really shouldn't need to cycle these Magic Brooms much more than just the 4 set are in there. But he is running the full 4 set. It's inkable. It's not a big deal. And this spot you might see like the small Elsas and some of the other builds. He is running a full set 4 set of the Queen, which I really like this card as a 4 of. The being inkable I think has really sold me on playing this as a 4 of. You're never going to be unhappy to see it in this deck. The deck wants something to ink, and then if you have an opportunity to play it on 5 and just turn it into a draw card engine, it is very strong as well. Maui, one of the best removal spells in red. The 7-drop Aladdin is huge in kind of catching back up or slowing down those aggro decks that may be within 2 or 3 lore of winning the game. This one kind of gives them pause to not be just randomly turning their character sideways, as he will actually take 2 lore from them. He does only have 2 of the 8-drop Elsas. This is probably the lowest number of these I have seen in a deck so far. Again, it may just been really cutting back on uninkables. This particular build has fewer uninkables. Still has a lot, but has fewer uninkables than most of the Ruby Amethyst control builds that I've seen, and he may have just made the big Elsa a concession for that particular build. He is running 4 of the 9-drop Maleficent as its top-end bomb, 4 Dragonfires, 4 Friends on the Other Side for another draw engine, 4 Be Prepared. I've seen some people talking about cutting these down. I absolutely don't think you can cut this to less than 4 of in this deck. He is running his item package with 2 Shield of Virtue, 2 Magic Mirror, and 1 White Rabbit's Pocket Watch. You may see some Ursul's Cauldrons and some builds as well. Usually those items are kind of mixed in sparingly throughout. So just taking a look at the deck on the surface and some of the opportunities that you can do just as general things to take advantage of on a deck. As you can see, the deck doesn't do a lot in the early game. I mean, these are all in there for very specific reasons, but none of these are really all-star cards. I mean, you have, I'm not saying any of them are bad, but these aren't the cards that are winning them the game right here. They're really just there to be slowing your opponent down early in the game, kind of to thwart, you know, just being completely overrun until you can get to your be prepared. Now, having said that, that's the biggest and best opportunity you can do when you're playing this game is against this particular matchup is to flood the board early and often. We want to try to get as high of an advantage on this deck before they really start getting into their bigger, more advantageous plays. I would say usually start around turn 5. Whenever Mali can start coming down, whenever Dragonfire can start coming down to really start slowing stuff down is usually when this deck kind of starts to shift gear. And then obviously once it can get to 7 is really where it shines. So what you can do early on against this particular deck is to play your cards out onto the field very early and often and force them to commit to this part of the game. Use resources out of their hands to slow them down during the early stages of the game is one of the most universally good ways to do this. Now the colors that are best suited for this, and not necessarily in combination, but usually one or the other in a deck, would be your Amber, your Emerald, or even to your lesser extent, your Sapphire. Those are those color combinations that really have a lot of early lore generators that they have to address because they can't just let you continuously spawn lore. Now this is twofold. This is going to get you up into where you could race them to this 7 spot if you're on the play. If you can generate 7 lore, or 20 lore rather, before they can get to 7, that's obviously where you want to be at, but it's also going to slow them down for their progression, which you can notice with these low costed cards again too, as most of these are inkable. So they're playing them as kind of a dual purpose. They're there to play if needed to slow your opponent down, but if they're not, these cards don't have a huge impact on whether they win or lose the late game, so they're trying to ink these cards. If you can force them to be playing cards on turn 1, on turn 2, on turn 3, while they're also inking on 1, 2, and 3, if they don't hit this draw card engine and Maleficent and friends on the other side, they're going to exhaust their hand before they can even get up to 7, often putting themselves into a top deck mode on turn 5 to where they have no cards in hand and they are drawing hopefully into one of these other late game draw engines, but it makes it very hard for them to stay on curve for these 7, 8, and 9 drops. So if you can do that, that is the first and easiest step against any of these control lists to take an advantage in that game. Now let's look at some specific cards that can actually make getting that advantage even easier for you. All right, we'll start out with Amber, and the combination of these 2 cards right here can really put a ton of pressure on the players that are doing. They're going to have to play something to answer the Lilo immediately. They can't let a 2 lore generator run rampant on them, so they have to be able to address her. Simba usually forces them to have to address this combination with 2 or more cards, which is perfect for, again, baiting cards out of their hand. And again, this serves a dual purpose in this combination of generating lore quickly. A lot of times this combination is good for 5, possibly even 7 lore against them, which can really set you up for a lot of success in squeezing out the last little bit of lore in the late game. But if you're able to bait 2 or even 3 cards out of their hand by playing either multiple Simbas or multiple Lilos out early, this really forces them to put a lot of resources into the early game where they really can't generate a ton of extra advantage. This is why I don't like the card Befuddle in the list. While it may answer the equation for the time being the quickest by just bouncing the Simba and allowing them to swing in with like something like an Archimedes. It also only answers the Simba temporarily, as they can replay the Simba and Alilo the following turn. You are -1 card, and you've only addressed 1 card at that point in time with the first befuddle. So this combination right here is an excellent start. If you're in Amber, these 2 card combinations should be something that you look for early and often in that particular matchup, as again, it serves the best 2 ways to attack the deck, which is generating lore early and pulling resources out of their hand early in addition to it. Right now, with as good as that 2 card combination is, this card can kind of do that all on his own. As a 2-drop 2 lore generator, again, a 2 lore generator is not something that they can let run rampant, so they do have to address him pretty quickly in the game, and by doing so, most often it is going to cost them a card out of their hand. Now, if they can challenge him and stay alive, they still have to play 1 card into play, which is fine. You don't necessarily need it to be an even trade because they can't ink that card any longer. So they can have to put something into play to take care of him, and then they're going to have to drop a card out of their hand. So this card here is going to be a 2-for-1 most often against the Ruby Amethyst players, with some exceptions, like a Rafiki obviously isn't getting an inkable card out of their hand. So if they can play a Rafiki and challenge into this, they've committed a card out of their hand, but it's not a card that they couldn't have inked already. But if they are forced to play like a Gaston or an Archimedes down so that they can attack and challenge this guy, then you're already 1 card ahead there. And if he gets challenged, they have to drop that card out of their hand is excellent as well, especially if you can get it before they're able to start going into their draw engine. All right, 2 other notables for the Amber and for Sapphire in the 2-drop spot with 2 lore generators. These are other 2 prime examples of cards that they just have to address, they can't ignore, and are going to force them to drop cards out of their hands to deal with. Now, obviously, out of the ones that we just showed, these are probably the lowest priority ones on the list, but if you've got a build with some extra room in them, these 2 cards could fit in excellently to help with that early game matchup for the Ruby Amethyst build. Now, the next thing we want to look at is kind of how they do control the board. Now, obviously, a lot of this stuff early on is put in to control the board. Gaston is a 4-strength reckless character. He is only in there to challenge. Rafiki is an uninkable 1 lore generating character, but he has Rush, so he is in there to challenge. I mean, we really don't get like a solid removal spell. You got Maui in here, who's reckless again to challenge, with the exception of Dragonfire. And then it jumps all the way up to like 7 and 9. So another way to really help exploit this matchup is not giving them the opportunity to use these characters as removal. As you can see, that for this particular list, that's 10 cards that they're looking at as removal in their deck. Their sole purpose is in there for removal. These are in there as inkable as well, but you know, the purpose in their inclusion is because they're in there to challenge characters to remove those characters favorably. So being able to generate extra advantage there. You can do this in a couple different ways, one of which, and probably the most obvious, is with evasive characters. So evasive characters being characters that can't be challenged except by other characters with evasive. That completely negates all of these characters that are in there that are there to challenge. Another way would be to have the characters that kind of have those negative or adverse effects whenever they are challenged. Characters like Cheshire Cat, Flynn Rider that we just talked about, but even cards like Cusco or Cruella de Vil as well, generating extra value when those characters are challenged. Paying attention to kind of the selection of characters that you've played, power and toughness of the characters you've played as well. I've seen some lists that have started running Mr. Shmee, who actually cannot be single challenged by Gaston or Rafiki. And the fact that he can come in and be followed up by a Rapunzel makes that card extremely good, especially, like I said, with a Gaston who's forced to challenge into the Mr. Shmee. Mr. Shmee trades evenly with the Gaston, and then they can play the Rapunzel to draw 3, still leaving the Mr. Shmee with 4 willpower after that as well, to create some additional advantage. Those are some of the cards that you can look at specifically to negate the effects of their early game removal. So now that we've kind of looked at how to play and beat the matchup in the early game, kind of how to play and manipulate the matchup in the mid game, what do you do at the end of the game whenever they have started drawing all of their big bombs? They have access to at least 8 ink, so nothing is off the table. They probably have at least 1 draw engine, if not 2 draw engines going at this point in time. What are your outs? Well, one of the most straightforward answers here is to get to your late game first. Colors like Sapphire allow you to ramp into your late game, getting to your Maleficents, getting to your bombs in the 7-drop Hades, or I've even seen decks that are running Triton now, just as a big body that is hard for your opponent to deal with, but you can get them out usually 2 to 3 turns sooner than the Ruby Amethyst player is going to be able to do that. Now, there are only a handful of colors that can really go this route, because the late game of colors like Steel or Amber or Emerald even really just can't compete with the top end of Amethyst and Ruby. Sapphire has some big stuff at the late game as well, but really when it comes to the end-all be-all of color combinations, these 2 color combinations really do have the largest characters that are out there, but being able to get to slightly smaller characters a couple turns earlier can make a huge difference in this matchup. Let's say you've been testing, you've been doing what you can at the beginning of the game, the middle of the game, the end of the game, and you really are so close, but you just can't figure out that last little piece of the puzzle. I will say that one of the cards that I've found be very, very effective in this matchup too, for a little bit of disruption, you have Forgotten Me. This card is an inkable 4-drop. It says each opponent chooses and discards 2 cards. This card on curve, especially if you went second, is absolutely devastating to the Ruby Amethyst player, because if they have committed 1 or 2 cards to the board, this is probably going to knock out all the cards they have in their hand on 4, and then put them in a complete and total top deck mode with only 4 ink in play, which should give you plenty of time to really take advantage of the board if you're playing the matchup correctly. Now, against a lot of other matchups, or if you go first and they start to draw cards, this card's just going to end up in your ink zone more often than not. But again, in those scenarios where you find yourself going second, this is a card I would absolutely mulligan for aggressively in that matchup, because on curve, there's very little chance that they're going to be able to recover quickly enough for you to make a difference in there. This, in combination with cards like Flynn Rider, if you are going first, can help be advantageous enough. But generally speaking, by turn 4, if you're going first, they're probably still going to have 3 to 5 cards in their hand at that point in time, depending on what they've played or been forced to play at that point. So it's usually not going to knock out what you need it to, because you really need it to get, if not every card out of their hand, at least 2 out of the 3 cards out of their hand, which forced them to hopefully get rid of anything that would have helped them stabilize early enough to counter. And then whenever we discuss that card, a lot of people bring up Sudden Chill as well. I do not like Sudden Chill. One, it is a 1-for-1 exchange. I am paying 2 or singing and discarding a card out of my hand, the Sudden Chill, to make my opponent discard 1 card out of their hand. Now, if they only have 1 card in their hand, this card can be very clutch. However, that's very hard to do if you don't already have some other way to disrupt their deck. That particular matchup, they're usually hitting one of their draw engines by turn 4 or 5. So the likelihood that you get them down to 1 card by then is really pretty slim. And you really don't want to play this on 2, because you really need to be playing something that's going to help generate value and force them to play something out of their hand voluntarily the following turn. rather than this just arbitrarily pulling the 8-drop Elsa out of their hand on turn 2 that they may shuffle right back into their deck. So it's really just not a good exchange of cards at this point. Now, if we get something in future sets that maybe adds an effect when this thing is sung to it as well, I could absolutely see this card playing that role of hand disruption a little bit better. But as for right now, I think the You Have Forgotten Me combined with possibly a Flynn Rider is probably the extent of the disruption that I would look at, with the exception of the next card here, which is A Whole New World. Now, this card seems kind of like an odd choice for making it a good card in this particular matchup, because the opponent's going to get to draw 7 cards. Now, I don't think this is a plug-and-play card for Steel by any stretch of the imagination, but what this card allows you to do is toss out most of the stuff that they probably mulliganed for in their opening hand. If you're playing it with like the 3-drop Aerial from Amber, you're going to be able to sing this on turn 4. Your opponent at that point in time is probably going to have as high as 6 cards left in their hand at that point in time. You're basically going to draw a fresh hand while they are left basically discarding their entire hand to get +1 cards in their hand. They probably mulliganed for a Be Prepared, so if you can hit a Be Prepared or 2 out of that, that's really going to put you in a very good position control-wise. It's going to give you a lot of information on what's left in their deck. And if you can couple these with multiples, a lot of times them combined with the draw card engine that they already have, this card usually remains a very strong draw engine and advantageous card to be played in that matchup. Now, they're always going to have plenty of cards in their hand, so they are going to be curving out in their deck. So you do have to play around that and play with that information. However, you're going to kind of be able to disrupt what their future plans are. If, you know, they play the little Elsa, planning on shifting into the big Elsa the following turn on 6, and you're playing A Whole New World and they have to trash their Elsa and they don't hit a new one, that's the kind of disruption that this card's really going to generate for that particular deck, and can really bring some advantage to yourself. Now, this can also be paired with cards like in Sapphire, like Belle and the Fishbone Quill, which allow you to jump your hand very, very quickly so that you're getting the full advantage of this 5 while your opponent is kind of left, quote unquote, holding the bag, so to speak. So you're ramping very exponentially fast while your opponent is not only, you know, having their hand actively disrupted, but they're losing the card advantage race as well. You're discarding 1, maybe 2 cards to get 7, and they're dropping 5 or 6 cards sometimes just to have a replacement of 7 cards come in as well. So having looked at that, let's take a look at a couple sample deck lists that you can try out. All right, first list we're going to look at is the Emerald and Amber list. This is one of my personal favorite lists from the 3 here. As you can see, very low to the ground, topping out at that 6-drop that we have up here. We talked about Lilo here is that early lore generation. You're definitely going to want to aggressively mulligan to have an early game here. Really focusing, obviously, if you can get Lilo and possibly Stitch for the ability to shift up into the 6-drop, which is less important in this particular build. It is there, and being able to hit a 3 lore generator on 3 is, or on 4 rather, is very nice. We do have LeFou here as kind of the watered down version of Flynn Rider, as those 2-drop 2 lore generators that are going to really force your opponent to continue to put stuff into play to deal with them. Simba here is almost a guaranteed pulling 2 cards from their hand, which is why he is amazing to have in that opening hand as well. Just continuing to put the pressure in with more 2 lore generators on 3. Obviously, Cheshire Cat is very good if you're expecting them to play the 5-drop Maui. I do prefer Mickey Mouse in a lot of scenarios, though, just because he is always going to punish 3 damage. So if they're trying to attack with multiple small characters, he's going to get both of them for 3, whereas the Cheshire Cat's only going to banish whoever finishes him off. And then just continuing, again, just laying on the pressure. We have Hans and Tinkerbell in the 4-drop spot. Talking about, you know, the heavy lore generation here with the lowest costed 3 lore generator. And then we have a 2 lore generator over here with evasive. Her pixie dust doesn't really come into effect in this particular matchup, but it can in other matchups that you are playing. Now, I did, Moana was kind of a new addition for me. I found whenever I was playing the deck that I always wanted to hit a 3 lore generator on 5. And I didn't always necessarily want it to be Cusco either, because sometimes I needed to keep him for after the Be Prepared. So I did end up adding some additional copies of Moana of Montanui. She is probably our worst 5-drop in here, but that's, you know, stiff competition though, because we have Cusco and Mad Hatter maxed out in that other spot there. I could see myself possibly bumping her up to 4 and maybe Rockstar Stitch down to 2. He is nice to be able to shift on 4, but a lot of times he just ends up being inked early on in the game. And you don't usually even get up to 6 ink with this particular deck. So if you do, usually it's just one of those things where it's not what you would have preferred to have happened in that game. And in that situation, if you're just playing him for 6, like, you'd almost just rather have almost any other one of these up there. His stats aren't really much more robust. We have Genie as a 2 of. And honestly, like, the Disappear is a nice addition, but it's mostly in there because he is another evasive character and another 2 lore generator at the top end. If we had access to another 2 lore generator evasive character lower than a 6, I would probably opt to play them instead of it. The Disappear can come in relevant sometimes, usually not in this particular matchup because you really don't want to bounce any of their stuff, but just keep in mind, I have used him to bounce Cusco in the past before, so I'll play Cusco, don't want him to get banished just yet, curve out into the Genie on the job, who may be enough to finish them off next turn and force a removal spell out of their hand, and then drop Cusco back down for another most likely guaranteed 3 lore the following turn. We do have 4 You Have Forgotten Me. This card is an absolute beast when you're going second against this matchup. I would definitely mulligan hard for this card because, again, in the matchup here, unless they play like a turn 3 Maleficent on their turn, to go ahead and start their draw engine, this card is almost always going to clear out their hand, which is a really, really nice place to be at because it gives you extra turns to get these guys doing what they need to be doing if the opponent can even recover at all. So absolutely love this card. Again, a lot of times in a lot of matchups, it's going to be inked, which is nice, but and especially in the control matchups, when you're going second, this card is absolutely fantastic to have in your opening hand. All right, next list up is our Emerald Ruby build. Again, a similar concept. We're going to try to get an early game established and then generate enough lore there to be able to pressure late game with our evasive and our ward characters. Now, the 1-drops in this particular deck are not as good and therefore not as important. So we do only have 6 1-drops in there, mostly just to make sure we have some play on turn 1 because we do want them, again, to feel the need to either play their Befuddle or their Archimedes or whatever 1-drop that they're playing. We want it to come out of their hand. So we do want to be able to threaten that 1-drop. We do have Flynn Rider in here as a 4 of. Again, just a very staple card. That 2 lore generator with his ability to make them discard when they're challenged is the best counter probably on turn 2 against any control deck that you're going to run into. I do like LeFou here because sometimes we actually just want this Flynn Rider to survive and get some more lore out of him. So being able to play him and play a LeFou is kind of like a pseudo Simba for red here. He can come down, restand Flynn Rider, and then they can't challenge Flynn Rider that turn. And stats-wise, he's perfectly fine for that 2-drop spot. And worst case scenario, just an inkable card there as well. Again, Cheshire Cat we're going to have in there as another 2 lore generator to help keep up that pressure a little bit. Aladdin here is not really so much a pressure as a bait for removal. A lot of times they will not be able to deal with you being able to shift into Aladdin on turn 5. If they let this guy sit out there for a while, it's probably safe to expect that they have a Dragonfire that they are saving in their hand. So just kind of play around that when you see it. Nothing wrong with just keeping that guy out there as a 2/2 for 1. Lore generation, they will eventually have to deal with him. Just try not to get 2 for 1 off of the Dragonfire. We do have Hans next, and Tinkerbell, similar 4-drop package as our last deck there. Again, same reasons for inclusion, lore generation, and evasive. We do have another 4-drop entry here, though, in Pongo. Again, he's basically just a slightly watered-down version of the Tinkerbell, as he has the exact same stat line, just minus the pixie dust, which, again, doesn't come up in this particular matchup very often. So just a very good card. 2 lore generators that they have to play events basically to take care of are very, very strong. Cusco, again, no introduction. This guy is a linchpin against control matchups, as well as he is basically a guaranteed 3 lore, which is a ton, especially if you have played your cards right. Getting 2 of these in the matchup and being able to live long enough to play them, I mean, you've got to think that effectively means you have to generate 14 lore elsewhere throughout the game, which is a much easier task to climb against control decks especially. Mad Hatter, very similar. We want to make sure we're keeping pressure up there. Goofy here is probably our worst 5-drop in this particular scenario. He does have evasive, which means they're not going to be able to challenge him with like their Maui or their Rafikis, etc. But he does not have ward, and he only generates 2 lore. But again, not a bad top deck if it is late in the game. Again, you just have to make sure that you're very focused on what numbers you're trying to get to, sacrificing favorable exchanges early in the game so that you can get to the lore that you need to get to. Something that also is something you have to be aware of throughout the game as well. We do have on our top end here Maui, again, just a very strong removal spell, being able to come down and crash into an Elsa and survive the exchange is very, very powerful. If it makes it to that stage in the game, being able to have him come in, deal with her, and they only get 1 use out of here is very good, and then forcing them to deal with him, or else he's going to trade with another one of their bigger characters. He also trades into Maleficent, not favorably, because they will both take care of each other, but I still think you're probably not going to feel too bad if that exchange takes place. And then Aladdin there is obviously in there to threaten the larger shift option from the small Aladdin. In your aggro matchups, he'll be a lot more of a scare than the control matchups, but they still don't want to see it, especially since, again, he is a 2 lore generator that can tip the scales if they are closing into the later stages of that game. Actions here, we do have 4 copies of Dragonfire. It's kind of a no-brainer as just a default removal spell once you hit that 5-drop spot. And then we do have 2 Shield of Virtues. A lot of times this will be inkable, but in certain matchups, especially in the control matchups, your card quality makes a huge difference. So having something out like this with Cusco is an absolute nightmare for control decks. That basically means they have Be Prepared is the only way they can deal with the Cusco if you have a Shield of Virtue out. So a very good card in that kind of mid to late game aspect to help squeeze some extra value out of the characters that you do have. All right, and then the last deck we are going to look at today is a pretty popular color combination right now. That is Steel Amber, but it may be a slightly different list than you are used to seeing. As you can see, it is very, very, very low to the ground on this particular list. Again, starting out with our 1-drop package here, but a little bit expanded. We've got Lilo, we have Stitch, we've got Captain Hook, we've got the Goons, and we've got the Steel Simba as well. Really just making sure that we can flood the board early and often. We're also playing Rockstar Stitch, so all these guys become 1-drop cantrips, basically, or draw cards off of that Stitch ability. We've got the big Simba to help protect these early plays, hopefully establishing a Lilo early or a Stitch early that we can kind of push a little extra lore before trying to kind of go off with this particular deck. We do have the Singer Ariel. This card is extremely good as she can fetch up a number of answers, which we'll look at here in a little bit, and be able to sing a lot of my 5-drop spells on turn 4, which is nice. You'd be surprised how much of a difference it can make as far as the timing goes, especially if we're looking at like a whole new world into a control matchup. That turn 3, they're usually playing like a Maleficent or possibly playing out a Friends on the Other Side. So to be able to play her on 3 and then basically Wheel of Fortune their whole hand away with the whole new world is a very nice little bonus for where this just falls on the natural curve here. We do have 3 of the little Tinks, which again are basically in there to shift into the larger Tinks that we'll get later. This battle plan's does come up from time to time, especially when you get to where you're drawing off the top and maybe miss on a draw. She can pitch that draw and get you a fresh card. We do have a Rockstar Stitch. This is a much more important mechanic in this particular deck. This Adoring Fans is really how this deck is trying to win. So mulliganing very aggressively for the Stitch combo is where you want to be at the beginning of this game versus the Amber Emerald list where it's kind of a secondary benefit. This one can generate a ton of card advantage very early in the game, allowing this deck to have games where it is beating your opponent on turn 5 way before they have the ability to play Be Prepared even. Big Tink is pretty self-explanatory here. She is a big threat that can come down, shift on the other ones, helps a lot in the control matchup, but also a decent sized body at 2 lore, especially if you can shift into her on 4. It's just another big character with 2 lore generation. Again, you don't really care in this particular deck if you get 2 for 1 off of it. If she actually pulls a Dragonfire and helps your Stitch stay alive, even better. But chances are they're going to have an answer for the first one of these that you have, so make sure you can capitalize on whatever comes after that. No surprise here, we've got another 4 copies of You Have Forgotten Me. Again, on the play, this card is pretty mediocre, has some situational uses, but on the draw, this card can absolutely be a blowout in these games if you can play it right on curve. Again, in this particular deck, when you have Ariel hopefully singing one of your 5-drop spells on 4, you can play this for free, or not play for free, but play it while the song has been played for free, which is very nice as well. And we get into our song package. A lot of these are in here. The Hakuna Matatas are really just in there as something to hit off of Ariel and then ink. I can't imagine very many scenarios where you actually ever play this. It could come up, but that is not what it's in here for. It's just kind of make sure to ensure, I guess, rather, that the Ariel doesn't whiff on her search ability and then just get inked. To a lesser extent, Be Our Guest is in that same role. You can search it up, have another card to ink the following turn, or you can sing it and then hopefully dig to whatever piece of the puzzle you're missing for the characters that you have on the board as well. We have our 5-drop ones. Grab Your Swords are in there kind of for the more aggressive matchups that you have. You can find yourself in some situations where these become quite good against control. Usually requires doubling up on them in a turn, singing one and then playing the second one, but it's still not a bad card, especially whenever it can be searched off of with Ariel and then sung for free off of Ariel as well. Whole New World is actually a very disruptive card for the control matchups. Now, this card does have some anti-synergy with the You Have Forgotten Me. We don't want to be playing this card to wipe out their hand and then trying to restock our hand with this one afterwards, because we're obviously going to be giving their cards all filled back up. But they kind of work in separate roles as well. If we can use Whole New World to offset them, then we can just ink the You Have Forgotten Me. I think if you have the You Have Forgotten Me and they only have 2 cards in my hand, this is absolutely the card that you elect to use, and you just sit on a Whole New World at that point in time. But they're really kind of doing the same thing, which is disrupting the cards that your opponent have in their hand. When they're playing that control deck, they're mulliganing for specific cards in that matchup, and they are making plans for the end of the game with the cards that they have in their hand already. So being able to play a Whole New World on 4 when they could potentially have 5 or 6 cards still in their hand at that point in time, and making them throw away all of that and then basically taking a whole fresh new 7 is very good, especially if you have already played a good number of cards out of your hand and it's actually a refresh of your hand and a complete blank on theirs. I mean, if they were holding multiple Be Prepareds, you know, they don't have any control over what goes to the discard whenever this card is played versus the You Have Forgotten Me. So while they don't work very well together, this one is very, very good if they already have a low hand count, where this one can be much more disruptive if they have a high hand count. So I do like them both in the same deck, even though they don't really play off of each other very well. And then finally, we have our 3 copies of Lantern. Now this card is extremely crucial to the deck going off with Stitch on a turn earlier because of the cost reduction to his shift ability. However, I don't think you can run 4 because any more than one of these is a huge burden to get out. It doesn't reduce the cost of anything else other than the characters you play, and most of the characters you play cost 1, minus the 2 bigger characters that you kind of want to shift into. So you don't want to see these in multiples, but you do want to have enough of your deck where you do see at least 1 copy of them.
So there you guys have it. There are some cards, some decks, and some strategies to help you beat the Ruby Amethyst list that you may encounter at your next tournament. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. And until next time, guys, Hobby Hero out.